Okay, thank you. I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And I think most of you probably know me. I'm Joan Buchanan, the new chair of the Budget Sub-5 Committee, and I look forward to learning much more about transportation and hopefully helping to develop a good budget for the state of California. So I think we're only going to have 3 members here today. We have one who couldn't make it and one who's ill. So we're going to go ahead and we will handle the vote-only calendar and the consent calendar as soon as Assemblymember Adams gets here. But in the meantime, we'll move to issue number 1. We'll move to item 2670, the Board of Pilot Commissioners item.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Miller. I'm president of the Board of Pilot Commissioners, and I'd like to take a very brief moment, but I would like to introduce our new executive director, Captain Alan Garfinkel. He's been on board for 10 weeks now. He's still learning the ropes, as they say in the maritime trades. I'll tell you just a little bit about him. He's a graduate of the California Maritime Academy and also of the University of San Francisco Law School. He holds an unlimited master's license from the United States Coast Guard, and he's a member of the California Bar. He's sailed for 30 years, 22 of them for Matson Navigation. We got him when he came ashore from Matson. Of those 22 years, he sailed on 10 ships, 9 of them as master. We're very happy to have him aboard.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Be happy to respond to your questions.
Okay. The questions specific questions I have on this issue pertain to the audit report that was done in 2009 and the update in 2010. And if you could just elaborate a little more on the findings and what actions you're taking, what corrective actions you're taking.
I will yield to my colleague on that.
Thank you very much. We took the audit as a great roadmap to improve our situation and our performance at the board, and answered pretty much all of the auditors' concerns all the way around, including the confidentiality concerns they had with the pilot information, the contractual concerns they had with spending that may have been outside of the state's guidelines, and a variety of other issues. Are there any specifics that you'd like to hear about?
I guess what concerned me as I was reading the report and the findings is that there seemed to be a real lack of procedures and controls in terms of how you operated and how you organize the work. I mean, in terms of responding outside of the 90 days in incidents, and the licensing, the renewing license or issuing licenses when the applicants hadn't had their medical examinations. I mean, as I read through the report and I read through some of your responses, it just seemed to me that there wasn't a real tight kind of procedures manual or system in place to make sure that you're meeting all the guidelines that are expected under state law.
That may be true or may have been true. I'm working real hard to put procedures together and in place that will prevent those kinds of things from happening. The board, in general, tried real hard to comply with the mandates of the Wiggins bill, but the level of staffing is a little on the slight side, so we're having trouble not only dealing with the day-to-day operations of the board, but to also step aside and create procedures that will prevent these kinds of things from occurring in the future. to have time to step outside of the tasks at hand to write procedures takes a lot of time. So we're working towards that goal, and we'd like to make it so that the board anyone can step into my position or any of the staff positions and create a seamless operation.
And do you have any target dates or anything by which you want to have those procedures in place or adopted by your board so that there's a higher level of comfort in terms of knowing that they're all being followed properly?
Well, we're working very hard on the rulemaking process to create the regulations that will establish the procedures in a more concrete way. Investigator standards, for instance, is one thing that the BSA pointed out, and we're working hard to make sure that we do a thorough job on each of those items. And so it takes some time with the monthly committee meetings and such, and going back and forth to make the language workable and airtight. So.
And I would just comment that many procedures that were spoken of or recommended by BSA are ones that we have already put in place. And we've had documented votes in our board meetings. And some of them are more difficult because it requires a lot of technical committee work. For example, on medical standards, we're working with the University of California, San Francisco. We have a consultant, Dr. Bob Kosnick, from their occupational medicine department. And he is in the process of looking at what we have and recommending to us what we should have. The next meeting of that committee is Monday afternoon. We'll know more then.
Great. My basic interest, I know that things don't change overnight, but my interest, I think, is the same as yours, and that is that within any organization, you want to be able to have seamless transitions. You want to have the procedures and processes in place so that the organization works because of how it's organized and not just because of who's in charge. And with the bar pilots, given the Costco Busan incident and all that, it's a more sensitive area, but your job is critically important to the commerce that goes through the San Francisco Bay, and it's important that we have those procedures in place. I don't know
I'm assuming your new arrival this is kind of your mission, is to get this in place, and that's the reason for the request of or this one additional staff person, is to free up some time to actually get these procedures moving.
Yeah, in my short period at the commission, I've seen that our daily tasks are keeping us away from making policy decisions and policy studies because our time is taken up by the core functions of the board, licensing and then opening mail and answering phones, and so a new staff person would free up the assistant director and myself to work on some of these issues and put in place the policies that we need to do.
It might free you up to be a director.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome.
Joan or the Assemblywoman has asked a lot of pertinent questions, and I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. That we're not taking action on this today. It was an informal meeting, but I appreciate your coming and talking to us. And we do have someone here from the audit division. If any of you have any questions on that. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking the time to hear us.
Thank you, Madam Chair and the committee.
We're not taking action, right?
On information, the first set of information request for the
Okay, right. Okay, now we'll move to, issue 2, that's approving the staffing request for the $75,000 for one new permanent position to address the filing and other clerical workload.
Do we have a quorum?
We do have a quorum.
Well, with the quorum, then I'd like to move the item and recommend approval of the staffing request.
Do we need to take roll first?
We should take roll first to accept.
Okay, let's go ahead and take roll.
Buchanan?
Here.
Adams? Evans? Fuhrer? Harkey?
So we have a motion and a second to approve the governor's, the administration request for us to augment the fund by $75,000 for one new position.
Call the roll. Buchanan.
Aye.
Adams. Evans, Fuhrer, Harkey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. What I'd like to do now, since Assemblymember Adams can only be here until 5 o'clock, is to move to the vote-only calendar and the consent calendar.
I'd like to move the vote only and consent calendars.
Is there a second? Sure. Okay. All right, can you go ahead and call the roll? That's right.
Buchanan.
Aye.
Adams. Evans, Fuhrer, Harkey. Aye. 3-0.
So the next item is the California Transportation Commission implementation of SB4, public-private partnerships.
Good afternoon. I'm Bimla Reinhardt, Executive Director for the California Transportation Commission.
Okay. I don't know if you all had a chance to read this, but this is the request is a one-time appropriation of $200,000 to contract out with fiscal consultants to provide cost-benefit and financial feasibility reviews for state public-private partnerships and design-build transportation projects. So, are there any questions?
Straightforward.
Okay.
With that, I actually approve the budgeted request, or actually make a motion to approve the budgeted request.
Okay. Second. Is there a second? Okay. Can we then call the roll?
Buchanan.
Aye.
Adams.
Aye.
Evans, Fuhrer, Harkey.
Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Moving right along here. Okay, now we're moving to the Department of Transportation, and issue 1 is the oversight CEQA assistance.
Good afternoon. Cindy McKim, Chief Deputy Director, Department of Transportation.
Well, as you know, the legislature passed a bill to exempt certain projects from the CEQA requirements. And, we have a report that gives us a summary of the projects and the original award date and current award date. So, could you take a few minutes just to elaborate on has this made a difference? Are projects being expedited? Are they getting out faster? Are we getting them to bid more quickly and putting people to work?
The short answer to your question is yes, for the most part. Of the 13 projects that were identified in ABX 28, one of those projects is a Sacramento intermodal track relocation. That project is being administered by the city of Sacramento, so it's not a Caltrans project. So I'm going to kind of push that one over to the side. Of the remaining 12 projects, 10 have, with a cumulative estimated capital value of $692.6 million and over 12,000 projected jobs, were delivered ahead of schedule, ranging from 2 months to 31 months ahead of time. The average length of acceleration is calculated on a mean basis is 15 months. 2 of the 12 projects were not accelerated because of federal permitting issues on one project and right-of-way acquisition issues on another. And I think one of the points I would like to make with regard to that is that kind of speaks to the need to really evaluate and choose carefully the kinds of which projects you select to do this. Typically, what we have found are the projects that have a lot of public support, that don't have environmental sensitivity associated with them, don't have unusual permitting requirements, are the kinds of projects to which you're able to really get the value of the CEQA exemption. Of the remaining 10 projects, 2 of the 10 accelerated projects have already been awarded. The US 101 project in San Luis Obispo County, which is a $50 million capital cost, was awarded in December 2009, 28 months ahead of schedule. And the US 101 Doyle Drive Phase 3 project, with a capital value of $220 million, was awarded in July 2009, 14 months ahead of schedule. So you can see that it really can work. Of the remaining 8 projects, the availability of bond funds was one of the critical issues that we struggled with. The bond measure, the latest bond measure was passed in November 2009. The bond sale occurred. And 4 of those projects are moving forward with bond funds that were made available through that November bond sale. But because it takes us about 4 to 12 weeks after allocation of bond funds, and you can't allocate bond funds until the bond sales occur, that meant that even though the projects were delivered ahead of schedule, we were not able to really take the full advantage of that because of the timing of the bond sale.
So when I look at the sheet here of the projects, there's one project here in San Diego that's scheduled to be awarded in June, one project in November this year, and 3 projects in December. Is that money going to be awarded out of the November sale, or is that going to be awarded out of a future sale?
The November bond sales went to the 3 projects that are scheduled to be awarded this month, and the June project, the San Diego project you alluded to.
Okay. So the projects then that we say are ahead of schedule that are due to be awarded in November and December, will that come out of a future?
Yes.
So. And so, can you just explain to me, since I'm a newcomer here, how do you measure that a project is 19 months ahead of schedule? What?
At the time we programmed the projects, they have a detailed construction schedule associated with them. So the date that our baseline was established on what that date would have been without any kind of accelerated CEQA or any exemption process or accelerated permitting process in place. Then we recalculated the delivery schedule based upon the CEQA exemption and the permitting to arrive at what that potential for acceleration would be. And then several of these projects, as I noted earlier, have actually been delivered, so we can actually document that that acceleration was, in fact, achieved.
Any questions? Go ahead, Senator.
Are you feeling confident that you're going to be able to get the bond funds that you need going forward? Have you spoken with the treasurer, and are you in the queue there for the next offering?
We have been not in contact with the treasurer's office, but working closely with the Department of Finance. They are a member of the board. We are feeling as confident as one can feel, given, as you know, the kinds of situations that we're all dealing with. Should the bond funds not become available, but stimulus funds, if there's another round of federal stimulus dollars that become available, these kinds of projects may be good candidates to do the kind of temporary loan that we did the last time when ERA was first established. So we have some other options that might be able to be used to keep the accelerated, to continue to get the benefit of the accelerated schedule.
Do you have any assurance that the stimulus funds are forthcoming? Is there a pot remaining?
No, it takes congressional action. There has been some discussion of the possibility of a second stimulus. It was really kind of hot and heavy about 4 months ago. Then kind of the health care thing slipped in front, and we don't know at this point whether there actually will be a Stim 2 or not.
Okay. Thank you. I was reading in the paper the other day that they've kind of backed off on transportation stimulus dollars. Thank you.
So, Member Adams.
Thank you very much. I think it's noteworthy that you point out that the accelerations have on a median been about 15 months. That's obviously good news for those of us who want to see these transportation projects happen, but it's also it's not normative. We're not expecting to continue to have year after year of bad budget times or the pressing need to that has predicated the CEQA exemptions or the CEQA waivers, as it were. Having said that, though, I think it would be incredibly helpful to this committee to have the input of Caltrans on the criterion that you would use in determining which projects would or would not be an appropriate choice for those kind of waivers. So again, with the caveat that I'm not necessarily sure we're even going to go down this road that many more times, it would be fantastic to have something that says, Caltrans, when you're judging these projects, here are the criterion that we would use based on what we know we have to do to get a project actually to the street. And that would, I think, really aid not only this committee but the larger body in making informed decisions and making sure that we're as effective as possible. So not to put a fine point on this, but if you are so inclined to do that, I know that I would particularly love to see that from you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and can we just for a minute have the LAO comment, because I think there was a report that came out that you put out saying that we had enough projects in the pipeline without the exemption. So would you comment on the acceleration and where we are?
Yeah, we had evaluated the administration's proposal last year when it was proposed, I think in December, as part of the governor's stimulus package and some of the special session packages in 2008 of December. And one of the issues that we had found initially with the administration's proposal, getting Mr. Adams to some of the points that you were making, was that there were federal permitting and certain things that were required on some of the projects. And so the initial set of projects that had been proposed over a year ago, we thought weren't necessarily the best candidates in terms of following up on the list of projects that have been approved and were in the legislation last year. All that we've seen is this list that you have before you, members. We don't have any additional information on these projects.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Then we'll move to issue 2, and that's the reauthorization of 75 two-year limited term positions for $9.1 million.
The department is requesting $9.1 million to reauthorize 75 limited term positions for 2 years to continue handling the workload associated with Proposition 1B. All previously approved proposals relating to Proposition 1B staffing are scheduled to expire on June 30th, 2010. Without adequate staffing for Proposition 1B, positions needed to administer the program to ensure results and accountability will be eliminated, and scheduled projects will not be able to proceed. So we are asking your approval to continue. Your staff had a question with regard to why we are choosing to do these with a limited term, because frankly, the bond projects are expected to be going through the construction phase. The administrative activities will continue beyond a 2-year period, so why are you only requesting a 2-year limited term? We believe that funding Proposition 1B projects on a limited term basis gives the department more control at the end of each 2-year interval for adjusting staffing levels to best meet our workload needs. So while it does impose some additional workload, accountability, and responsibility on our part, I think that that is something that would be appropriate for us to come back to you at the end of the 2-year period, because what we're finding as the Prop 1B program continues is some of the workload we thought would be there there's some adjustments that may be possible. So I think it is appropriate to reevaluate this. It is not a permanent program after all.
Madam Chair, I'd like to move this as approved as budget.
Is there a second? Or any other discussion or questions?
Previous roll call.
Substitute the previous roll? All right, we'll go ahead and we'll substitute the previous roll on this then. And we'll move on to issue number 3, the request for funding to meet the air quality mandates.
The department requests a one-time increase of $57,330,000 in operating expenses from the state highway account to comply with various federal, state, and local air quality control mandates. This request will fund the mandated replacement and retrofit of 435 vehicles. Specifically, 288 vehicles will be replaced and 147 will be retrofitted. This helps us achieve compliance of the mandates adopted by the California Air Resources Board, South Coast Air Quality Management District, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. This request is part of a multi-year request to achieve compliance. The total anticipated resources needed over a 5-year period are approximately $159 million. As noted by your staff in their recommendations, we are working with the Air Resources Board to explore the possibility of a temporary 1-year deferral, because what we're finding is with the effect of the economy, we've had some delays in actually being able to acquire the vehicles. We have not had final decision with regard to those discussions yet, so our suggestion is in concurrence with your staff's recommendation to hold this item open.
Yeah, this is incredibly troubling. It's important to go back in time a little bit and remember what CARB told us when they implemented the regulations, and that was they expected the entire fleet, California's entire fleet, not just Caltrans's portion, but the entire state fleet, to cost approximately $60 million. And now we're looking at something on the order of $250 million for Caltrans alone. The fact of the matter is these regulations are not just hurting our ability to effectively balance our budget, but they're making it impossible for the state of California to be fiscally responsible. And this is not an indictment on Caltrans. You're in the position of being the recipients of these bad regulations. But I want to be on the record as saying that this is just an intolerable situation. The fines and fees alone for being out of compliance could literally run somewhere upwards of $215,000 to $220,000 a day. A day for being out of compliance. I mean, that's a staggering number when you think about this. And I just want, Madam Chair, to really make it clear that we have to encourage our colleagues, we have to encourage this body to revisit these questions and to rein in some of what's going on in CARB if we're going to be able to even effectively manage our own body. And that doesn't even speak to the larger issue of how this is impacting the private sector and the folks in California who have to abide by these same regulations.
Member Harkey.
I agree with my colleague here. I'm amazed with the shortages that we have and the funding issues and the deficit that we can't, as a legislature, maybe just defer some of these items till we get through a budget resolution. We know we're facing some shortages of, close to $20 billion for the next, 4 or 5 years. And we're forcing... or maybe better yet, if we could mandate something or write a regulation that as these vehicles become obsolete or get replaced, that they fall under the new criteria rather than retrofitting. And I really think that this is something we need to look into. They can't be doing that much harm in their current state. I would like to see some kind of legislation. It would really help. It would take it out of your budget. We're using Caltrans money here to retrofit vehicles that, quite honestly, will probably be replaced in time, and we could update at that point. So that's more, I think, what I'd like to see. I just don't understand why we have to be doing this. And it is having an impact outside, but in particular here in the state, with our own agencies being subjected to an appointed board's mandates that are costing us more money, I find this, just a little bit offensive. I think we do need to do something, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to figure out a plan and how to deal with this. Thank you.
Well, I would just say that we're sort of crossing over from a budget area to a policy area, and right now we have a law that requires certain air standards, and CARB is doing what we're asking them to do. So I think and certainly if the mandates stay in place, then the state has to lead by example, or we can't expect others to comply with them, and nor can we afford the fine. So I think the staff recommendation, which you concur with, is absolutely appropriate here, that we hold this open and pending negotiations when we bring it back at a future date.
First of all, thank you, Madam Chair, and I completely agree with that decision. I think it's the right thing to do. But I think it's noteworthy that we have other budget items that we're actually looking at, and we're asking for a pittance comparatively to try to make sure that a lot of our agencies actually have the bare necessities to be able to function. And the fact is, the kind of money that we're talking about having to spend for the retrofit means we're not putting people to work. We're not getting people the proper levels of governance that they deserve to have. And I think it's an atrocious abuse of the system to have one government agency abusing another government agency. And when the taxpayer is the only one who's connected all the way around, who doesn't see the benefit of it directly. So it's frustrating.
You've made it very clear that it's frustrating. And, I would only suggest that the business before us right now is whether or not to approve the allocation, and I think there is concurrence here that this should be held open pending additional information later in the year. So we will move on to issue number 4, the load rating of state bridges.
The department requests approval to redirect 9 positions to complete load rating evaluations on approximately 6,800 state bridges. This request also adjusts the federal and state fund split for these activities to maximize federal funding. While the department is satisfied that our bridges are designed and constructed to appropriately address safety issues, we are not in compliance with newer FHWA requirements to provide updated load rating evaluations. This request allows the department to come into compliance over the next 10 years. FHWA concurs that this is an acceptable time frame.
Are there any comments from the LEO?
Jessica D. Giambattista with the Analyst's Office. We do recommend that Caltrans look at the possibility of actually getting this work done more quickly, and specifically as the department is putting together its staffing plan for its capital outlay support program, a very large program in which they have many bridge engineers and people who would be qualified to do this work. If the work is not there in that program, then we would recommend instead using those people to get this work done more quickly, since this is a clearly established workload that the department does need to do as required under the federal audits and some of the findings from FHWA.
Are there any questions? Senator or Assemblywoman?
I'm just trying. We're shifting 1.3 million to fund the positions, and I know this is being deferred, but they're using 57 million for retrofitting. I have to make the point here. I think this is maybe that this actual work here is a better idea. So I appreciate your report, and I appreciate what you're doing and how you're trying to use a patchwork quilt to keep things in order. Thank you.
Our recommendation here is to hold this open. What I would like is I would like you to explore whether or not the project can be accelerated beyond faster than the 10 years, and what it would take to do that, or if we can accelerate it in a way that I'm sure we're prioritizing anyway. The transportation, there's a joint transportation committee hearing a month or so ago on the Bay Bridge retrofit, and it was clear, for example, that the bridges that have those I-bars are more susceptible to stress and to failure, and so somehow telling people that it's going to take us 10 years to complete this study just seems like it's not the way we should be going. So, my recommendation is that we accept staff's recommendation to hold this open, but maybe when you come back to us, you can do some work to let us know what it would take to accelerate this work, so we can actually have a better idea of the real work, the safety work that needs to be done.
We have done that evaluation, and we have estimated that it can be done within 6 years with the use of 19 positions a year, for a total of 117 positions over that 6-year period, and a total dollar cost over that 6-year period of $17 $1,680,000.
Could you go ahead and provide that information to my office, and I'll provide it
Absolutely.
to the other members? Because,
Yes.
given the recent earthquakes we've had and other things like that, it just seems to me that a decade is a long time.
I would like to stress, however, these are not safety inspections. We are and have been and are continuing to inspect all of our bridges and the local bridges as well on the federally required mandate. This is a load rating determination. When we design and construct our bridges, we know what those load ratings are. When we get requests to transport extra legal loads or permits over structures, each time that happens, those bridges are reevaluated for load rating. So I didn't want to leave you with the impression that this load rating issue presented an immediate or near-term even safety kind of an issue. But we will provide that additional information.
That would be great, because, when I read this and talks about determining load ratings and the weight or load that the vehicles can safely, to me, that is a safety issue, because we want to be sure that the bridges have the appropriate rating, so that that there are no potential safety issues later. But I would appreciate it, and I will forward the information to the other committee members. Issue 5, new environmental requirements.
The department requests 6 permanent positions and $566,000, including a one-time increase of $154,000 for interagency agreements, for a total request of $720,000. This is to be funded by exchanging local federal subvention funds for state highway account dollars. These resources will be used to address new federal environmental requirements resulting from changes in the Safe, Accountable, Flexible, and Efficient Transportation Equity Act, a legacy for users, Safety Lou. In addition, other new or revised environmental laws and regulations and changes to the Federal Highway Administration policies and procedures require changes in implementation of existing environmental laws as they affect local agencies. The Senate side approved only half of the funding. Your staff had asked us to provide some additional information with regard to how the funding might be split so as to maximize within that same kind of dollar threshold. And we are suggesting that rather than cut the resources from 6 to 3 and also have interagency agreements, that we have 4 staff and eliminate the interagency agreements so that we are providing the services at the same cost and reconciling it that way.
And I think the LEO has some comments on this as well.
Yeah, we evaluated the department's request, and based on the information that they're providing to do these specific, tasks, which is sort of a marginal increase in the overall workload of this division, it seems reasonable, but we really don't have a lot of information about the total staffing and the total workload for their entire local assistance division to know if they really need, 6 more people to do this work, or whether they would already have sufficient staffing levels to do this work. And so we're recommending that the department provide a report talking about what their workload is for the entire division, and we would recommend that that be done after the adoption of a new federal act, since the workload for this division is largely driven by the federal program. That would provide the legislature with information to not only just reevaluate the staffing levels for this division, but then when these incremental changes come in along the way as federal regulations change, it would provide a basis for actually evaluating that, and we think would be much more helpful to the legislature.
And we agree with the LAO recommendation.
Okay. So, member?
Actually, I just hope you could illuminate me a little bit. I don't actually know very much about the local assistance program or what the division that is in Caltrans does as it relates to that. I was hoping you could just enlighten me.
Our local assistance program, when the state of California receives funds for projects that are actually implemented by local agencies, it requires the state to provide oversight for those funds. So the funds come into the state and they go through the department to the local agencies, and we are required to ensure that they are meeting all of the requirements that the government imposes on the use of those funds. We have, over the past several years, been the unhappy recipients of some critical reviews by the Federal Highway Administration that suggests that we are not exercising as much oversight in the local assistance area as they would like. So we are trying to work through that with the FHWA and provide the additional oversight to make sure that the funds ultimately used by and implemented by local agencies are meeting all of those federal requirements. If they don't meet the federal requirement, then we have to repay the federal government for whatever level of funding was not in compliance with their
And so just as a budgetary concern then, if the federal government is mandating that the state of California act as middle managers, to what degree do they contribute to the financing of the work that you're trying to do? And why is this having to be something that the state of California has to do beyond it?
We are trying to work with the federal government so that they will enable us to actually directly bill for what I'll call these federally imposed administrative costs. We are having some difficulty with that because the federal government does not want to recognize if you have a unit whose only responsibility is to provide oversight, they'd rather see those be direct charges. And since we're not incurring the costs ourselves, the local agencies are doing the work, you can't do it as a direct charge. So we're trying to work that through with the feds to enable us to be able to do it. It's not been an easy persuasive effort on our part. But what we have done in the meantime is we're kind of swapping state highway account dollars for local agency federal dollars so that we can use those local dollars on the state project to reduce what the state highway account would otherwise have been spending and replace them. So in effect, we're trying to accomplish the same purpose. We'd like to get to the point where happily we could do it without this game, but it requires the agreement of the federal government, and so far that's not been easy to achieve.
And Madam Chair, I share the concerns of the LAO as well, that while it doesn't sound like a lot of positions, 6 positions out of a group of 360, it is difficult to believe that without having more information, that it's not possible within the context of the 360 existing positions to be able to accomplish the work.
So, Harky, do you have any questions? I read the report. We talked yesterday about just the overall need to have more information to make decisions, and I've never been a big fan of workload budgets because with workload budgets, every time you do something new, it just gets bigger. And I know that sometimes with federal mandates, obviously we have to comply with them because we need the funding. So I do have some language I'd like to review with you that I think both the LAO and Caltrans has adopted. But I do think as we move forward, it's critically important that we do some real workload analysis in terms of the actual staffing requirements and how we best get the job done, because even if we're taking federal funds that was allocated at the local level, that's money that's being taken away from other projects, and money that the locals are depending on to get the work done. So let me read this to you because I don't have copies to pass, but it would be that it combines the two, that the California Department of Transportation shall report no later than 180 days after the adoption of a new Federal Transportation Act on the department's local assistance workload and staffing levels. If legislation is enacted at the state level to implement the federal act, then the department shall submit the report no later than 180 days from the date of enactment of the state legislation. The report shall include 1, a baseline review of the department's local assistance workload, including a listing of major activities performed, the level of resources needed to complete each activity, and how the workload aligns with the current staffing levels, a description of the charges to the local assistance workload from requirements of the new federal act.
Fairly consistent with LAO.
Right. So yeah. So I and Caltrans is in agreement with that. So I think at a minimum that should be included. So I don't know how we if there's consensus here on how to proceed. The Senate approved half funding. There is a recommendation here from Caltrans to approve 4 staff members and have no interagency agreements. We can.
Well, Madam Chair, I think on our side, we're probably still going to be no's, but if Madam Chair wants to make a motion just so that we can leave the roll open, I'd be happy to give a courtesy second.
Okay, I just have the suggestion that we vote on the staffing first and the reporting separately.
Okay.
Unless do we want to leave this open to the next meeting? That's the other.
Madam Chair, I'd be happy to make a motion to adopt the supplemental report language.
Okay. Is there a second on that? Okay, call the roll.
Buchanan?
Aye.
Adams? Aye. Evans? Fuhrer? Harkey?
Okay, and the staffing we'll leave open. Okay, thank you. Item number 6, the it's probably just that issue 8. Okay, we're going to change just slightly. I pulled issue 7 from the agenda today, so we have issues 6 and 8, and issue 8 requires a vote, and so could we take that out of order? This is the project initiation documents.
The administration requests to shift 96. I have to put my glasses on.
That's right, I understand.
Oh, God. The administration requests to shift 96.5 positions and $12.5 million from state funding at the state highway account to local reimbursement for department workload associated with project initiation documents or initial planning documents for locally funded projects.
Elio, maybe your comments.
The administration has 2 requests related to its planning program and project initiation documents. The January request, which is the item on your agenda, addresses just a portion of the program, and they have a finance setter request, which will be heard at a later point by this committee, that addresses the full program. And so we would concur with your staff recommendation, which would also be consistent with an action taken in the Senate to reject the January request and then just come back and review the request for the budget for this program as a whole. That would also allow us more time to evaluate the recently submitted workload information for the entire planning program.
Madam Chair, I agree with Elio, and I'd like to move that we reject the request.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, take roll.
Okay, Buchanan?
Aye.
Adams? Aye. Evans? Fuhrer? Harkey?
Jeez, we're moving right along. Issue number 6, the public-private partnerships.
The department requests the establishment of continuous appropriation budget authority for availability payments associated with public-private partnership agreements. Total availability payments over 30 years are projected to be up to $3.45 billion or $115 million annually for 30 years. The availability payments will be used to fund construction, operation, and maintenance of high-priority transportation projects. Any use of the available appropriation authority would be subject to legislative review as necessary during each year's budget process, as well as legislative review contemplated within 60 days of signing a lease agreement required by SBX 24. Your staff has asked for an overview on how P3 contracts function, what their advantages and disadvantages are, and how Caltrans ultimately would make the decision as to whether it's in the state's best interest to pursue a P3 contract for a project. And I have our P3 program manager here, Kome Ajise, who can respond to that and answer any questions you might have.
Can we get the LAO comments and we'll go to questions?
We reviewed the administration's proposal and find that it's problematic in several different ways. First, the proposal overall does not appear to be permissible under current law. SB 4 contemplated P3 agreements that had some toll or revenue generation. This project, the projects that they're considering for this proposal and the proposal in general seems to provide funding for projects that wouldn't have some sort of revenue generation, and so it seems to be inconsistent with what was approved in current law by the legislature last year. In addition, details regarding how the majority of funds would be spent have not been provided. The department has been able to identify one project that would use about $1.2 billion from the $3.5 billion in funds, but the remaining $2 to $2.5 billion in funds would be appropriated for some unknown, yet to be determined set of projects, and we would recommend that the legislature not approve funding for projects that it doesn't know what it's approving the funding for. The proposal also contains provisional language in the budget bill that would allow the Department of Finance to augment the amount of the appropriation indefinitely and up to any amount over time, essentially creating a blank check for the administration. And so for all of these reasons, we would recommend against this. In addition, the one identified project that Caltrans is looking at, they have provided a business case document to look at some of the options for funding the project through a P3 procurement versus a traditional procurement. And we haven't been able yet to identify what benefits the state would get from doing this. And in fact, it appears that given the level of availability payment that they're contemplating here and the total cost of the project, that it might actually cost more to do this under a P3 approach, given that this project already is fully funded with traditional funding sources and is very far along and is in fact half of the project's already under construction. So we'd recommend rejecting the request.
And you got comments on exactly what your process is for the P3s?
The LAO has raised a number of questions, and I'm going to try to attempt to address as many of them as I can remember at this point, but I would appreciate the questions as well, just to clarify. To start with, we have been working on a project, as the LAO mentioned, the Presidio Parkway project, under the authority of SB 4, and we do believe that SB 4 allows us to do that project, otherwise we wouldn't have pursued it up to this point. We spent some months, the recent months, analyzing the project, doing a business case analysis on the project to make the determination as to whether or not it's suitable for P3. And the result of business case is that, in fact, there is appreciable value for money to be had in pursuing a P3 option for this project. The project in question is in two phases. It's the Presidio Parkway project. That's the southern access to the Golden Gate Bridge, otherwise known as Doyle Drive. There were 8 contracts under the project. The opportunities that was provided to us in the project setup was such that the first 4 contracts, which are all underway right now, were able to go on. But there's a time period between when the 4th contract ends and when the 5th contract begins that allowed us to be able to do this analysis, and without missing any opportunity to keep the project on schedule, we were able to do that. And so we're taking the last 4 contracts 5 through 8, and we're packaging that as the P3 project for construction and ultimately for a lease agreement that would allow us to maintain that facility through a concession agreement over 30 years.
I have one request to speak. Ted Toppin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ted Toppin for the Professional Engineers in California Government. Here to urge you to reject this proposal. PEG has taken a post position on the Doyle Drive replacement as this availability concession payment model. It is not authorized by law. Obviously, that is the LAO's determination. There is also a Ledge Council determination that makes it very clear that it is not authorized by law and specifically does not authorize Doyle Drive. I provided that committee staff earlier today. Forgive me for not doing so earlier. But availability payments language of this structure of a 3P does not appear in that bill. The bill says shall toll. The committee analysis says require tolling. So we would urge you to reject it. It is just not authorized under current law. The bill also requires that Caltrans perform certain functions on P3s, and those requirements have not been met to date, and there is no plan to comply with them going forward. Finally, we think this violates Article 16 of the Constitution. This commits the state of California to a long-term debt. In the case of Doyle, $1.4 billion, and the proposal $3.45 billion. That requires a 2/3 approval of the legislature and a majority vote of the public to incur that kind of debt for taxpayers for 30-plus years. We would also say that if they would get back to doing the design is at 50% completion. They could keep this project on schedule and going to contract by October. That was the original plan. Now they've sort of thrown that schedule up in the air. I'd also say that if they were to competitively bid these projects, they do get a lot better price. They are to cost, contracts 5 through 8 are to cost $473 million. The last two contracts awarded, 3 and 4, came in under 40% of the engineer's estimate. There's every reason to believe that this can be delivered for $400 million or less. Instead, the proposal here is to commit the state highway account to $1.4 billion over 30 years, and that means 57 other counties will be building a 1.2 stretch of road in San Francisco for 30 years. That's $30 or $40 million out of every county for 30 years. We would urge you to reject the proposal.
Are there any questions or comments? Councilmember Harkey.
I just have to ask the obvious. How did this project get in here? How did it become part of this process? If you can tell me.
Well, notwithstanding the current, we believe that the Presidio Parkway project does present some real opportunities, not only for saving money in the long run, but for managing the project on a different basis than we have before. We believe that there are risks that are associated with the delivery of projects, and the public-private partnership approach enables you to monetize those risks and deal with them more effectively than the traditional design bid build model. Given where we are now, and there's another point, let me make this point, because we keep hearing that this project is fully funded. This project is fully funded through construction, but it is not fully funded through the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of the facility over 30 years. And that, I would suggest, is one of the kind of inadvertent downsides of our traditional way of budgeting in the state, because we do not budget life cycle costs at all. And it encourages a focus on the original construction and totally disregards what that long-term need, rehabilitation, and maintenance. And what we're seeing in other states, in other countries, is that by incorporating those longer-term operating and maintenance requirements in the original project proposal, in the original finance plan, in itself yields cost savings over the period of time. I think that it would be a shame to lose the opportunity to at least get us to the point of opening the bid. He's absolutely right. We are seeing wonderful cost savings with the bids that we are opening late. Those same cost savings are going to translate into the proposals that we receive from the competitors for a design build for the P3, operation as well.
Do you have any other questions? Well, the recommendation is to hold this open, which I agree. I have to make this comment. The Transportation Commission is going to make ultimately some decisions about Doyle Drive and the best way to proceed. But having just taken a trip to Canada and seen how they work with their P3 partnerships, I mean, they find that at most, and that this is a country that aggressively pursues them, that at most they work in 15% of the projects. Okay, and they have independent authorities that can evaluate when they're appropriate and when they're not appropriate, and that authority is separate from what would be equivalent to our Caltrans or the private sector. And we just approved in item 1 $200,000 to have some kind of evaluation, because I think it's important that evaluation be independent. But the item before us is to authorize $3.45 billion in the form of a continuous appropriation. And the problem I have is I don't see, given this budget, how we can afford to make any kind of continuous appropriation, especially when we don't know which projects we're going to be funding. Because right now there aren't any other, we can talk about Doyle Drive for a long time, but there aren't any other projects that are scheduled. So to hold out that kind of money when anyone driving up and down the roads in this state is dealing with potholes and roads that are in terrible repair, that may not be the best allocation. So I truly believe we need, when we talk about how we're going to allocate the money, it has to be allocated based on a need basis. And ultimately, we can talk about later about how we evaluate the best way to meet that need. But a continuous appropriation over 30 years, given the state's budget situation right now and the demands we have on local roads and state roads, I just don't think is appropriate.
Well, I appreciate the chair's statement on continuous appropriation. I think what, in fact, we're asking for is a transparent signal to all that this is all the state is going to have available to do to commit to APs, availability payments, over time. And what that does is it creates some stability in the market for us. It allows everybody to know from the perspective of the state what's available to do this type of financing. And it doesn't necessarily hold the funds away from other things, because unless we have projects, we couldn't use that appropriation. However, you would have signaled the transparency that there's nothing to hide in terms of the state's commitment to P3s, and this is the totality of the state's commitment to this funding of P3s.
Is there something I'm missing? You're saying a continuous appropriation does not commit money to a particular area of the budget?
Well, it would commit, in the case of Doyle, for example, in the case of Doyle Drive, allows us to come in and ask and go through the process and ask for that to obligate part of that appropriation. However, the rest of it is available for future projects to use.
And it's not just the $3.45 billion continuous appropriation. The implications for the state highway account are real. You talk about failures in Canada. We have a P3 failure in San Diego right now. The State Route 125 tollway has filed for Chapter 11. They are defaulting on $200 million in federal loans. If that circumstance were to apply to projects that proceed under this availability payment model, and it would be the state highway account that would be on the hook to pay for any cost overruns or any failures of contractors to perform. I mean, that's an extraordinary liability to place on the state highway account that is oversubscribed right now.
Well, I really would not want to debate the issue, but I would be remiss if I didn't react to that, because I think what we're proposing under SB4 is a different type of P3, and the state would not be under the obligations that Mr. Toppin is characterizing is available. It's happening right now. The approach, in fact, the approach of doing P3s in California is governed by, I think, there's a transparency that's been injected with SB4. There's a commission that's involved. There's a PIAC review that's involved as well. The Public Infrastructure Advisory Commission that's involved. So there's a level of review that's different than has occurred in the past. Beyond that, the strictures, the regime of contracting that we will be under is such that, especially with the availability payment mechanism, will be such that we will be paying for performance. And if there is no performance, there's an opportunity to cure. And so it's a different approach, and I wouldn't want to leave the characterization that was made about P3s in general.
Well, I don't think what's before us today is a discussion of P3s per se in terms of what the value is or not the value is, how they should be used. The question before us today is, do we want to allocate $3.45 billion as a continuous appropriation for 30 years when the only project that's been identified and you're going to have to work through the Transportation Commission is Doyle Drive. And when I look at the remaining $2 to $2.5 billion, I have a hard time committing that money to projects that aren't even identified when we have such extensive need in our highway system. And I applaud some of what you're looking at, because whether they're P3s or state projects, however, that you put out to bid for regular contractors or whatever, we should be looking at life cycle. We shouldn't be looking at the cost of building roads and not being able to maintain them. I mean, it's in all of our interests. So much of what we're doing there it's the right thing to do regardless of what kind of project you have. But again, my issue is does it make sense today to have a continuous appropriation when 2/3 of this money is for projects that haven't been identified? So I tend to agree that we should keep this open and, until, this is a staff recommendation, until there's a decision on Doyle Drive is final at the California Transportation Commission.
I concur. We're in dire straits in the state, and we are deferring. We just deferred, last month, $4.9 billion in payments, which will basically get us through to the end of the year. We've borrowed from everybody, and now to continuously appropriate, we can't do that because we're not sure. The only thing that we continually appropriate that I kind of approve of is at least we're going to pay our bond payments. Those are continuously appropriated. But to continuously appropriate projects right now is a little frightening, because we begged, borrowed, and stole, plus we borrowed from over 719 internal accounts. So we're not in a position to forward fund, and I understand what you're asking for, and I appreciate your needs, but we really have to be ogres in this right now. Thank you.
Now, can I close with, last year at this time, the authorizing legislation went through, and PEG was neutral on that legislation, because you'll remember at the time the debate was about P3s will bring in new money to build new facilities that will never be built with existing revenue. Boy, we've sure gone a long way from that model. Now P3s don't raise revenue. They raid the state highway account for 30 years. That is not a model that serves anybody.
Well, obviously, what I would say is this discussion is to be continued, and I'm sure that there'll be much more to say on it at a later date.
Thank you.
I think that completes our agenda, and I'm happy that we're out of here in a little over an hour. Thank you. Thank you.